Well, I'm very glad to be with you. I'm sorry I have to be there electronically and not in person, but that's, I guess, the nature of airlines these days. On a beautiful day, our flight was delayed for several hours. Anyway, this is such an important topic, and I'm really grateful to have the chance to be with you even electronically. Many of us for years have been concerned that climate change was sort of like an offshore hurricane. You could predict it, you could see it coming, you could foresee its damage, but it hadn't yet made landfall. Well, turns out it's starting to make landfall in the form of some pretty dire predictions that I'd like to mention to you. The first has to do with the explosion or the collapse of the carbon asset bubble. These warnings are coming from Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, and its insurance oversight chief. We are seeing very significant publications in journals like Nature and Nature Climate Change, peer-reviewed, making the very same warnings. How is it that this carbon bubble is a problem? Well, the fossil fuel industry has not done a very good job in recent years of telling the truth about much of anything, and it appears right now that they're actually fooling their shareholders and fooling themselves about the future of their reserves. So the bubble happens, or pops, I guess I should say, when the inevitability of these reserves not being achievable finally becomes apparent. So let's look at a couple of slides that relate to a recent report that Exxon prepared about its reserves. The first one relates to the market that Exxon anticipates for electric vehicles. This chart starts at 2018 and runs through 2040, and it shows the electric vehicle growth curves expected by a whole variety of folks who look at this. The very bottom estimation, the lowest of them all, is Exxon's estimate of electric vehicle growth. Turning to a second slide, Exxon also estimated in its climate risk report the growing market for electric trucks and buses. You see that Exxon estimates 0 electric buses in 2040 and 0 electric trucks in 2040, whereas today's market shows that there's a significant percentage of the bus fleet that's already electric, and a dominant position for electric buses expected by 2040. The numbers for trucks are less strong, but still very, very different from Exxon's premise. A third premise that Exxon has made is exhibited in this slide. The upward bound line is Exxon's forecast for the growth of renewables. That is overset against two lines, which are wind costs and solar costs. Those are the downward sloping lines. And I put them on top of each other because you see that the downward sloping lines for wind and solar are now well within the fossil fuel cost range. That's the pair of arrows up and down on the right of the slide. What's interesting about Exxon's proposal is that at about the time that these costs are competitive with fossil fuel, they assume that renewables growth will actually decrease. That in the earlier environment where wind, for instance, was particularly expensive compared to fossil fuel, the fossil fuel growth nevertheless persisted. Now that it's actually in the range and we're seeing actual renewable plants displacing even operating fossil fuel plants, they're predicting renewables growth to go down. The final premise that Exxon has in its report is its estimate of CCS deployment. If you look at the top bar, that's what IEA suggests CCS deployment is likely to look at. The bottom bar is what Exxon predicts CCS is going to look like. Obviously, the more carbon capture technology, the more their emissions can be offset, the more their reserves are achievable. And so a high estimate in this case favors Exxon's ability to tell its shareholders that it can achieve all of its reserves. But what's interesting about this is that it does not appear to us, from having taken a good look at it, that Exxon's investment is matching its anticipation that this enormous boom in CCS will take place. If this were going to be this global, epic, world-changing explosion, you would think Exxon would want to be a part of it, and that its investment profile would be dedicated in this area, and we see very little sign of that. So you put all that together and you end up with a situation in which neither Exxon nor its shareholders appears to be properly preparing for the reserves of this company not being achievable, and you spread that across the fossil industry, and there's your carbon bubble. We will get hit particularly hard, according to these reports. Regions, I'll quote, regions with higher marginal costs experience a steep decline in production, for example, Russia, or lose almost their entire oil and gas industry, for example, Canada and the United States. That's because when the cartel breaks down, as people realize that they have to flood the market to get any value for their reserves, then the lower cost producers will be able to outprice higher cost producers. So they'll be able to hang in there in the crashed market a little bit longer, whereas for the United States, our more expensive production will price us out of the market far more rapidly, leading to a more pronounced crash in the United States. There's a related threat that is out there as well, and that is the threat of a crash for coastal real estate. We're hearing this warning from sources as broad as Freddie Mac, the great federal housing entity, Risk and Insurance Magazine, and the Union of Concerned Scientists. If you take a look at this map, this is Rhode Island, my home state. You'll see that all along the coastline there are areas that are bright blue. All of those bright blue areas are areas that will be lost to Rhode Island with 10 to 12 feet of sea level rise, which is what is predicted in a no-action scenario by the end of this century. The very map of my state changes. Let's close in a little bit on the upper half of Narragansett Bay, and you can see how communities in Rhode Island that right now are very economically successful, very heavily developed, and very important to our state, get flooded out. Again, it is all that blue that is now land, homes, businesses, infrastructure that the ocean reclaims by the end of this century. And as these facts begin to work their way into the back end of a 30-year mortgage, and the ability of that mortgage to get insurance, and the ability of that property to get flood insurance, that's what will trigger the coastal property values crash. So with these two potential landfalls of climate change, a carbon bubble crash and a coastal property values crash, the work that you all are doing becomes even more important. It becomes even more important that we make sure the public understands what the real science is on this, what the facts are. It becomes more important that we identify and out the climate denial apparatus that the fossil fuel industry maintains. It becomes more and more important that we call on our friends in the corporate sector, companies like Apple and Google and Microsoft and Facebook, companies like Goldman Sachs and Bank of America and BlackRock, companies like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, who all have good climate policies and are interested in sustainability, that we call on them to show up in Congress, which they're really not doing right now, and lean in, particularly now that we have a Democratic House of Representatives, to help support Republicans to come on board and understand that this is a real matter of urgency and national security. The last thing that I will say is that it is also important for us to understand that despite what the big oil CEOs are saying about recognizing that climate change is real and recognizing that their product is causing climate change and saying that they support a price on carbon, what we see in Congress from the ground is that the political operation that those CEOs pay for and run is still 100% dead set against the policy that the CEOs claim to support. You saw a little window on that with the heavy big oil spending against the carbon price out in Washington state in this past election. And I see it every day in Congress, where the groups that are supported by the fossil fuel industry, including the companies whose CEOs claim to take this seriously, are still 100% politically dedicated to preventing any action on climate change. These companies ought not to be allowed to get away with that divergence between what they say and what they actually do. And that's a place where we can all provide a little bit of added pressure. So again, thank you for giving me this time. I again apologize for having to kind of wing this in front of a camera rather than be there with you live. But I appreciate very much your attention to this. If there's anything that I can do to be helpful in moving this issue forward and in working with you, please do not hesitate to call on me. What you are doing is so important. Thank you.